On a suffocating night in Natchez, Mississippi, the Beaumont mansion stood silent and sealed tight. Every door locked from the outside, and the seams of the locks fused with melted lead. By dawn, only smoke poured from the grand white house, twisting into the morning sky. When the townsfolk finally broke through the bolted doors, they found Alistair and Eleanor Beaumont dead in their beds. But Isabel, the woman who tended their fires, was gone. Some said she perished in the blaze, but others whispered that her ghost still wandered the ruins, her footsteps echoing softly in the ashes. To understand how that night came to be, we have to step back to the day before the fire in the blistering summer of 1835, when the air itself felt like another form of bondage. The Beaumont estate was a monument to stolen prosperity. Its white columns gleamed, its crystal windows sparkled like watchful eyes, and the air smelled of magnolia, sweet enough to almost hide the stench of sweat and smoke drifting from the slave quarters. Inside this world of privilege, Isabel Fletcher moved quietly, polishing the family silver. Her movements were steady, deliberate, her reflection warped in the curved metal like a stranger's face. Though her hands were scarred from labor, her mind was sharp, alert, and burning with thoughts she dared not speak. To the Beaumonts, she was invisible, a shadow made to serve. Alistair Beaumont ruled his land with soft-spoken cruelty, the kind that needed no shouting. His authority was effortless, his empathy non-existent. Eleanor, his wife, was a different kind of tyrant, thin, sharp, and relentless. Her power came from humiliation, from turning every task into a test that could never be passed. When she entered the dining room that morning, her silk dress whispering against the floor, she inspected Isabel's work with cold precision. She lifted a spoon, found a speck of tarnish invisible to anyone else, and let her voice slice through the humid air. "Do you call this clean?" she said, her tone dripping with venom. Isabel's eyes stayed on the floor. "Forgive me, mistress. I will do it again." The spoon clattered back into the tray, loud as a door locking shut. When Eleanor swept away, Isabel stood frozen, her rage smoldering beneath the mask of obedience. It wasn't about the spoon, it was about everything that had been stolen from her. Her freedom, her name, her brother Jacob, sold just 2 weeks earlier to the sugar fields of the South. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised oranges and purples, but the heat refused to fade. Inside the mansion, preparations were underway for another Beaumont party, a glittering distraction from the rot beneath. Eleanor, desperate to maintain her perfect facade, issued one last order to Isabel. "The air feels heavy tonight," she said, waving a lace fan that barely moved the thick air. "I want strong fires in every room. The heat keeps away sickness." Isabel bowed her head, the spark already catching somewhere deep inside her chest, a fire that would soon consume everything. "Keep them stoked until dawn." "I won't have this house feel like a swamp," Eleanor said, snapping her fan shut with a sharp flick. Isabel stood motionless, her expression blank, her voice still. But her eyes betrayed her for just a heartbeat when they met the wide, frightened gaze of young Sarah, who was polishing brass nearby. Sarah's look was part pity, part warning. Everyone in that house knew what the order meant. Keeping 3 great fires burning through a Mississippi summer night wasn't just cruel, it was deadly. And in that moment, something inside Isabel shifted. It wasn't rage, not exactly. It was something colder, clearer, a decision. Years of quiet fury, grief for her brother Jacob, and the grinding humiliation of servitude, all fused into a single sharp point of purpose. She looked down the grand hallway with its polished floors and glittering chandeliers and saw not a home, but a tomb, a monument built from bones and suffering. Even the cicadas outside seemed to scream now, their chorus rising like an alarm in the heavy night air. The idea came to her, not like a flash, but like a lock turning. The fires, Eleanor demanded, would serve a new purpose. Not for warmth, not for comfort, for freedom. As twilight deepened and long shadows bled across the estate, Isabel moved with steady precision. The usual chaos of party preparations masked her movements perfectly. She was no longer a servant. She was an executioner, a priestess performing a final ritual. Her first stop was the smokehouse, a cramped, airless building thick with the reek of hickory and salt. Sent to fetch a ham, she reached with one hand, while her other scraped soot and hardened creosote from the chimney wall into a small pouch. It was the residue of countless fires, dense, oily, and dangerously flammable. She felt its weight and knew it was enough. From there she went to the workshop, her steps quiet on the worn boards. The air smelled of sawdust and turpentine. She was sent for beeswax to polish the staircase, and she took more than needed wrapping a heavy block in cloth. Her eyes roamed the shelves until they landed on an iron ladle long-handled, blackened from melting lead. It felt heavy and true in her hands, like a symbol of judgment. Outside she gathered scraps of lead flashing, bent nails, broken keys, bits of the mansion's skeleton now destined to play their part in its end. Each pocketed piece clinked softly, the sound of inevitability. By the time the sky turned purple with dusk, Isabel's fear and determination existed side by side. Fear was cold and tight in her gut. But the fire in her chest, her resolve was steady, fanned by memory. She thought of her mother, the root woman who taught her the ways of herbs and fire. Fire cleanses, child, her mother used to say. Sometimes the earth is so poisoned, you have to burn it clean before anything new can grow. Isabel's fingers tightened around the pouch of creosote. She wasn't just setting a blaze. She was clearing the ground for something beyond herself. Near the woodpile behind the kitchen, she found Cato, the old field hand. His back was bent, his hands busy carving wood, but his eyes were bright and knowing. "The air is angry tonight, little bird," he said without looking up. His voice low and heavy like thunder. Even the trees hold their breath. A fire built in anger burns hotter than any other. His words lingered in the air between them, part warning, part farewell. "It is a hot night for fires," Uncle Co, Isabel said softly. "The mistress insists." Cato looked up, then his gaze cutting straight through her calm. "The mistress insists on many things," he said. "Be sure the fire doesn't take the hand that feeds it." He handed her the small carving he'd been working on, a bird with wings half spread, ready to take flight. Isabel accepted it silently, tucking it close to her heart. Then she turned toward the mansion, its windows glowing with lamplight, unaware that before the night was through, those same windows would shine with something far more terrible. The little bird was carved with patient care, each feather etched like a promise. Cato called it a conjure charm and pressed it into her palm, saying, "This will help you fly," his dry, warm fingers steadying hers. And Isabel closed around that tiny talisman, feeling it both impossibly light and somehow anchored to the long line of stories about flight and freedom. Whispered among her people, a blessing and a burden that tied her act to something older than herself. Later, the dining room blazed with candlelight and clinking crystal, while the house swam in roasted meat and expensive wine and perfume. The guests wrapped in their own small pleasures, as if the world outside did not exist. Isabel moved through them like a shadow, refilling glasses and clearing plates she could smell but never taste, watching the men talk about cotton and sales with the same casual cruelty they used when speaking of buying and selling human beings. Hearing Alistair brag about a family he had broken, and knowing with a cold, simple clarity that Jacob and people like him were the reason she would do what she meant to do. When the last carriage wheels died away and the house settled into the heavy sleep of midnight, The chandeliers dimmed, and the grounds fell quiet. Isabel became something else, slipping barefoot across polished floors, touching the mahogany and silk, not as treasures, but as proofs of theft, and pulling everything she had gathered into a small circle of purpose. In the scullery, she built a modest fire in the stone hearth, kindling a clean pine flame, and with the iron ladle from the workshop, she began to melt the lead she had scavenged, watching it sweat and darken, and then flow into a bright, molten pool, like a tiny sun born in the dark. The smell was metallic and sharp. The danger real, every move precise, because one mistake would end everything, and when the metal was ready, she moved methodically from door to door, locking latches and pouring hot lead into keyholes until each seam cooled into an unbreakable seal. Each fused lock, another step toward the irreversible. She sealed the kitchen, the garden doors, the side entrances, shaping the house into the trap it had always been for those who lived inside, but never saw themselves as prisoners, and at the front door she paused, remembering how she had studied its heavy bolt for years, how its inner iron bar could be turned into the final proof of her decision. Her shadow stretched like the silhouette of a giantess against the walls as she worked the small wooden bird warm against her chest. Cato's quiet warning and her mother's teachings of fire and cleansing wrapped around her like armor. And with each poured drop of lead, she felt the terrible necessary weight of what she had chosen to do. She had studied every inch of that door for years. The narrow brass mail slot was her answer. From a broken broom, she'd saved a long wire thin strung, nearly invisible. With slow, deliberate care, she looped one end around the bolt handle and fed the other through the slot until it dangled outside into the night. When the moment came, a single tug from the darkness would slide the bolt shut, and a second pull would free the wire, leaving a door that seemed locked from the outside by impossible means. It was simple, perfect damming. With every door sealed, Isabel stood in the foyer, the air thick and heavy, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. The house was no longer a mansion. It was a tomb, and she had sealed herself inside with her captors. For an instant, raw panic gripped her. What if she failed? What if the fire didn't spread? What if she was caught before it began? The questions clawed at her, cold and wild, until she looked down at her hands blackened with soot, trembling, reeking of smoke and metal. The same hands that once polished silver and served wine were now the hands of destruction. That realization steadied her. The fear drained away, replaced by icy resolve. She thought of Alistair Beaumont's smug laughter, of Jacob's tear-streaked face, of every stolen life and broken body. This wasn't murder. It was balance. It was justice. She was no longer a servant. She was a force of nature, a storm that would burn away rot. Her steps on the grand staircase were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The wood creaked softly beneath her bare feet. She ascended, then turned back down again, calm now, moving like someone carrying out a sacred rite. One by one, she visited each hearth. In the parlor, she sprinkled the creosote over the glowing embers. A sudden roar filled the room, a burst of blue-green flame leaping upward like a living creature freed from its cage. In the study, the same. In the library, surrounded by books she would never be allowed to read, the fire caught and raced across the shelves like vengeance itself. The fires began to speak to each other, first as whispers, then as howls. Smoke thickened in the rooms, crawling along the ceiling, curling around the chandeliers. It gathered, multiplied, grew dark and oily, refusing to rise, pressing downward like a living thing. The air turned to poison. The house groaned as if it understood what was happening to it. Isabel moved through the haze, steady and silent. She knew this house better than anyone, the drafts, the weak points, the way air flowed from one room to another. Every detail she'd learned in a lifetime of servitude became her weapon. Curtains shifted just so. A chair tilted closer to flame. A ledger tumbled to the floor. She wasn't simply setting a fire. She was dismantling an empire brick by brick, breath by breath. When the smoke reached the staircase, she began to climb again into the storm she'd made. The air grew thick, the walls disappeared, and the world blurred into gray. The heat clawed at her skin, but she kept moving, her silhouette flickering like something half spirit, half shadow. The smoke wrapped around her, pulling her into its swirl until she seemed to dissolve within it. And as she climbed, the memories came. Her mother humming softly in the garden, Jacob crying as they took him away. Friends vanished, soul beaten, broken. Every injustice the house had hidden now poured into the air, given form in the choking clouds. The portraits on the walls, stern white faces framed in gold, seemed to twist and recoil as the smoke devoured them, their power erased in the same fire that had fed their wealth. Outside, the town of Natchez began to stir. The horizon bruised purple with dawn. Elias, the night watchman, turned onto Beaumont Road for his final round, the air still heavy and strange. And before he could even see it, he smelled it, the acrid scent of burning magnolia and ruin, drifting from the hill where the great house stood. Elias was bone-tired, his feet aching from hours of walking the quiet streets of Natchez. The air was heavy and still, the kind of suffocating humidity that clung to a man's skin and made even breathing feel like work. He was thinking about his small house, his thin mattress, and the promise of a few hours' rest when he passed the Beaumont estate, a familiar silhouette of white columns and black shutters looming against the gray horizon. At first glance, the mansion looked as it always did at this hour, silent, still sleeping. But then, just for an instant, something flickered in the corner of his eye, a faint wisp of smoke curling lazily from behind a shutter. He squinted into the darkness. Probably a candle left too close to drapery, he thought. A careless servant's mistake. But then came another thin thread of smoke, this time from the study window, and another darker, heavier, from the library. His heart gave a hard, sudden thud. "That ain't right," he muttered. He started walking faster, then running, his boots slapping against the dirt road. By the time he reached the wrought iron gate, the first faint orange glow had appeared in the parlor windows, pulsing like the heartbeat of some enormous creature trapped inside. He grabbed the bars, shaking them hard, shouting before his mind could even form the thought. The word tore through the early morning quiet, a raw human cry that echoed off the grand facades of neighboring mansions and sent birds scattering from the trees. Within minutes, lights flickered to life in nearby houses. Doors opened. Pale, half-dressed men and women spilled into the street, their faces blank with shock as they watched the Beaumont mansion come alive with flame. Smoke billowed thick and black, the fire growing with unnatural speed as though the house itself were feeding the blaze. The air filled with the smell of burning wood and magnolia, a sickly perfume that turned the stomach. Then came the sounds, the crack and pop of beams, splitting, the shattering of glass, the low animal roar of a fire too far gone to fight. Someone began ringing the town bell, and moments later the volunteer brigade came charging down the lane, a jumble of men in half-buttoned shirts, dragging a hand pump led by Chief Finch, a broad, sweat-streaked man with eyes that had seen too many hopeless fires. "Front door," he barked. "We get through, get the hose to the stairwell, and move fast." Two blacksmiths rushed forward, throwing their shoulders against the massive oak door. It didn't move. They hit it again, the impact shaking the frame, but the wood held. It was like slamming into stone. Again, Finch roared. They tried once more, harder this time, the thud echoing like cannon fire, but the door didn't even creak. Damn thing sealed. One man panted, his face gray beneath a layer of soot. Not bolted solid. Finch shoved past him, running his calloused hands along the edges of the door. No looseness, no give. His fingertips found the keyhole and stopped. It wasn't a keyhole anymore. It was filled packed tight with something hard and metallic. He He flicked open his clasp knife and scraped at it. The blade skittered off with a sharp metallic shriek. He leaned closer, scraped again harder, until a thin shaving curled away and gleamed dully in the firelight. It wasn't paint or wood or wax. It was metal, soft, heavy. His stomach dropped. He pressed his palm against the seam where the door met its frame and felt the same cool, unnatural smoothness. The whole door had been sealed. Welded. "It's lead," Finch whispered, staring at the silvery residue on his fingertips. The word hung in the smoky air like a curse. Behind him, the fire gave a sudden monstrous roar, the windows bowing outward as the inferno inside reached full strength. The men stumbled back as the heat punched into them, faces turned away from the blinding light. The great white columns were blackening now, paint bubbling and splitting as the mansion's perfect facade began to die. And inside, unseen by any of them, the woman who had built this fire was already gone, her shadow lost to the smoke, her name already melting into legend. Finch straightened his face pale beneath the grime and firelight. "It's lead," he said hoarsely. "Melted lead." The damn thing sealed shut. The words seemed to hang in the air unreal, until one of the men repeated them, then another and another, until the whispers spread through the fire crew like a sickness. Sealed. The realization hit them all at once. This wasn't carelessness or accident. Someone had meant for this to happen. Someone had turned the Beaumont mansion into a furnace. Finch barked orders, sending men running for the kitchen entrance and the garden doors. But within minutes, the answers came back the same. Every door, every window, every way in or out had been fused solid with lead. The house wasn't burning, it was entombed. The idea settled over the men like a weight too heavy to bear. The fire was raging, the heat unbearable, but it was the thought of what it meant that made them tremble. Who could have done it? How? The flames paid no attention to their confusion. They had grown wild now, climbing the walls and spilling from the upstairs windows in long orange tongues that writhed against the paling dawn. The roof sagged, groaning, and Finch knew they were out of time. "Axes," he roared. "We go through the windows." The men surged forward, driven by panic and purpose. Axes smashed through shutters, glass shattered like gunfire, and clouds of sparks exploded outward as they forced holes through the blazing facade. The onlookers flinched at every impact, but could not look away. The Beaumont mansion, the proudest house in Natchez, the monument to generations of arrogance, was coming apart before their eyes. It was more than destruction. It was desecration, and the crowd felt it. Some stood rooted in awe. Others murmured prayers. The firemen, sweating and soot-streaked, swung harder not just to save lives, but to fight the creeping fear that what they were battling wasn't natural. The air seemed to vibrate with something alive, something vengeful. A little down the road, beneath the wide arms of an old oak, Mrs. Gable watched the inferno with her thin hands clasped tight against her chest. She had known the Beaumonts all her life. Been to their dinners, admired their house, pitied their servants. Yet her thoughts weren't with Alistair or Eleanor. She was thinking of Isabel. She'd seen her only yesterday sweeping the porch in the afternoon sun. The girl hadn't looked up until the last second, and when she did, her face was still as carved stone, but her eyes, those deep burning eyes, had unsettled Mrs. Gable in a way she couldn't explain. There had been something final in them. A look that said, "It ends soon." Now, as the mansion devoured itself, a cold shiver ran down the old woman's spine. The others were asking if the firemen could reach the Beaumonts in time. But she was wondering something different. Something darker. Was Isabel trapped in that blaze? Or had she finally escaped it? When dawn broke, the fire had lost its fury, reduced to a hissing, smoldering ruin. The air was thick with steam and the stench of wet ash. Chief Finch and his men tied handkerchiefs over their faces and climbed through what had once been the parlor window, their boots sinking into a sludge of soot and cinders. Inside was ruin. The fine rugs and furniture were gone, replaced by a blackened skeleton of beams and twisted iron. Water dripped from the ceiling, hissing where it struck glowing embers. Everything was slick, treacherous, and dead. They moved slowly through the wreckage, lanterns cutting weak beams through the lingering smoke. The house groaned around them, its bones cooling, but not yet safe. Upstairs, they found what they had dreaded and somehow expected. In the master bedroom, beneath a collapsed section of ceiling, Alistair and Eleanor Beaumont lay side by side in their great bed, as if peacefully asleep. The sheets were barely singed, their faces untouched by flame, pale waxen and utterly still. There were no burns, no wounds. They hadn't suffered the fire's fury. They had died before it reached them, smothered quietly by the smoke they themselves had ordered lit. Finch stood in the doorway, the lantern trembling slightly in his hand. The only sound was water dripping from a beam above each drop, landing with a slow, steady hiss on the rug. A layer of fine gray ash covered the bed like a burial shroud. The room felt less like a crime scene and more like an altar, one built to a god of vengeance they didn't understand. The men began their grim search for Isabel. It was assumed she would be found downstairs near one of the hearths, her death either tragic or damning depending on who told the story. They combed through the wreckage boots, crunching over glass and char, but no body was found. No bones, no trace. Only the faint impression of a small bare footprint in the soot near the back hallway, leading toward a shattered window and the cool blue light of the coming morning. They dug through the wreckage until their hands blistered their shovels, scraping against stone and charred beams. The parlor yielded only the blackened bones of chairs and the warped remains of silver candlesticks. The study offered nothing but puddles of melted wax and ruined books that crumbled into pulp at a touch. In the library, the air still smelled faintly of scorched paper and leather, and the sodden heaps of ash told the story of knowledge turned to smoke. Room by room they searched the rhythm of their shovels, slow and grim, each man secretly dreading what he might find and what he might not. When they reached the back of the house, the collapsed scullery was a jagged mound of debris and stone, still warm to the touch. They pried it apart piece by piece, sweat streaking through the soot on their faces. They were looking for something, anything that could confirm what everyone already believed. A body, a scrap of cloth, the smallest fragment of bone. But the ashes gave up nothing. Isabel Fletcher was gone. By mid-morning, the fire was long dead, and the sun was climbing, spilling pale light over the ruins. The house, or what was left of it, steamed and hissed like a dying creature. Chief Finch stood near the front gate, staring at the shell of the mansion. His men were silent around him, their exhaustion matched only by their disbelief. "It makes no sense," Finch muttered to Elias, who had stayed through the night, the lines of smoke and fatigue carved deep into his face. "We've torn this place apart. She had to be inside. There's nowhere else she could have gone. And yet..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Nothing. Not a trace. Elias looked at the ruin, at the thin plume of white smoke twisting up into the flawless Mississippi sky. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, distant. Maybe he said the smoke took her. In the days that followed, the Beaumont mansion became both crime scene and legend. The official account printed in the Natchez Ledger was simple. Isabel Fletcher, a slave woman, had set the fire in an act of vengeance and perished in the flames along with her masters. But no one could explain the sealed doors or the missing body. No one could make sense of how a house locked from within could burn so completely without leaving a single human trace. The questions multiplied until they became something else, A story whispered in parlors and on porches, passed from mouth to mouth until it grew roots in the town's conscience. Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who had watched the fire from the shade of her oak, claimed she saw a figure moving away from the house just before dawn. A silhouette darker than the smoke itself slipping into the trees without a sound. Another man down the road swore he was awakened that same night by a strange rhythmic beating like great iron wings lifting off into the sky. But the tale that endured was simpler, quieter, and far more haunting. People said that if you walked past the ruins after dark, when the air was still and heavy, and stood by the old iron gate, you could hear it. The faint, steady sound of footsteps pacing in the ashes. Back and forth, back and forth. The restless tread of a woman bound not by chains, but by the memory of what she had done. Isabel Fletcher was never found. No record of capture, no mention in any parish roll or runaway notice. She had vanished as completely as the smoke that carried her story into legend. Some said she escaped through a hidden passage she alone knew of. Others whispered she burned so completely that even her bones turned to vapor. But there were a few Elias among them who believed something far stranger. They said she didn't die at all. They said she changed. Now, on hot Mississippi nights, when the air grows thick and the magnolia trees sway without wind, folks claim they can still hear her soft, measured footsteps in the ruins of the Beaumont estate echoing in the dark. Isabel Fletcher, the woman who locked the doors before dawn, who turned her prison into her pyre, walking forever in the ashes of her freedom.